Hi, I'm Bill Bradley. Join me for a recent excerpt of American Voices. Retired Army Colonel Claude Schmid served in the military for 31 years. His service is an inspiration, but perhaps his greatest gift to his country is what he's done after he left the military. When veterans are in hospice care, his organization sends people to visit them, to make sure they have someone to talk to make sure they're not alone. It's called Veterans Last Patrol. They have 700 volunteers in 29 states and counting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Harvey. It was an honor.
I've never been before.
Oh, and you deserve it.
Like this.
You deserve it.
Well, thank you very much. Just glad to know that people appreciate it.
Oh, we still care. Yes, we do. You're a hero.
Well, thank you all so much.
The purpose and what they do is just a beautiful thing. Colonel Schmid is here with me now. Welcome to American Voices, Colonel Schmid.
Thank you, Senator Bradley. I appreciate the opportunity to be on with you today.
So how did you get this idea in the first place to do Veterans Last Patrol?
Well, that's a great question, sir. And basically it goes back to my time in the military. My last assignment, I was the chief of the Wounded Warrior Evacuation Program. Perhaps the most important thing I learned from that job was that beyond the medical care, which is, of course, vital, what they like most is just to be able to talk to somebody. So once I got out of the military, I was thinking about that. What kind of great adversity does our veteran community face? And one of the things that came to me was hospice care. And eventually I learned that there was far too much loneliness there, that there weren't fellow veterans visiting, veterans in hospice care. So we started this nonprofit to bring awareness to this issue, the loneliness and the companionship that helps defeat that loneliness when somebody's in end-of-life care.
What a beautiful thing to do. I mean, growing up, was there someone who inspired you to prioritize kindness in this way?
Well, there certainly was. And when I was thinking about what to do and thinking about how to continue to serve, I remembered that my mother had once volunteered for a lady that was dying. Back in the day, they really didn't call it hospice care, but this lady was dying. And she would go once a week and visit this lady. And at the time, I was maybe 10 years old. I had two younger brothers. And when my mother would come home after her visit, we'd have dinner around the dinner table, and she would describe a little bit what was happening to this lady from week to week. That particular person had ALS. And so my mom would describe what she experienced and what they talked about. I remembered that as I was getting out of the Army and wanting to continue to serve, that she had volunteered for hospice. So that's how we got started. I volunteered myself, and then it led to this nonprofit a couple years later.
So how does Veterans Last Patrol actually work? When you hear that there is a veteran who's in hospice, what do you do? How do you go about sending a volunteer?
Basically, what we do is we connect those individuals wherever they are. Let's say they're in Kansas City, for instance. We would connect them with a hospice care provider that is in that area. We find out the veterans that are in hospice care, and our volunteer would, after some orientation, some training, would get the opportunity to go make one-on-one visits. Typically, it's a weekly 1-hour visit to the veteran in hospice care. And the way hospice works today in our nation is about half of it is done in private homes. The other half is in a care facility, like a senior care facility, assisted living, memory care, one of those very important care facilities. And they deal with veterans and, of course, American citizens at large in hospice inside those facilities.
So you meet them. What advice and instructions do you give the volunteers?
So our role is companionship. We tell them to have a receptive ear and to, spend most of their time listening. One of the things we find, interestingly, is that late in life, the veterans that are in hospice care, and this would probably apply for anybody in hospice care, they tend to be a little bit more open, a little bit more talkative, even if they were very reticent throughout most of their lives. When they get into end-of-life care, they often will open up a little bit more. They open up, reveal some information about themselves, perhaps, and their life story that they otherwise didn't talk about. They feel comfortable talking about it with a fellow veteran.
Interesting. So there's a true connection made between the volunteer and the veteran.
There really is a true connection. even though they may have served, 50 years apart in uniform, there's still a lot of commonality about service. Our volunteers, they tend to say that they get more out of this kind of volunteering than they think they're actually providing to the patient.
Yeah, I'll bet.
I volunteered to go to Antarctica for submarine duty. So I got submarine duty. They knew what was best for me.
Yeah. Well, they drafted me because I quit high school. They said, if you don't like high school, we're going to send you to school.
Somewhere where you really don't like it.
Yeah, sure did. Changed my attitude.
Well, they have a way of adjusting it a little bit.
Oh, yeah, they do. Yeah, and that Jody call, I remember those.
Yeah, it was good.
Kind of like the one we had this.
Can you tell us about some of the veterans and how these visits really help them?
There's so much loneliness out there, so they tend to be very receptive to these visits. I know, for example, one of my very first clients that I began to visit was a World War II veteran. His name was Joe, and he had been a landing craft operator in D-Day, World War II. So he's a landing craft operator, and as they were going in on D-Day, the adjacent landing craft to him got shot up very badly, and several of the crew members went into the Atlantic, went into the ocean, and he ended up jumping in the water and rescuing a crew member from the adjacent vessel, brought him out, saved his life, and those guys became lifetime friends. And that individual that he rescued ended up sending him a box of cigars for the next 44 years, every year on the anniversary of D-Day. So, that's the kind of story that you share and you hear about. Joe told me this story when I went to visit him, and we would talk about his life experiences and his family. And in his case, he was all alone. He lived in a small one-bedroom apartment. He had a caregiver that visited him a couple hours a week, but other than that, he was alone. He was very isolated, and I would come in, and adjacent to him on his couch, where he always sat, was a picture of his wife, who had been was a very beautiful woman, and she'd passed just a few months before I got to meet Joe. So he was now alone. So that picture was always there when he and I were sitting together. So we frequently would talk about his wife. And next to the picture was the urn, his wife's urn. And so they had a very close, long marriage. And of course, it's very difficult for him to lose her. But he would speak about her a lot to me, as well as other life lessons and experience that he had. And so I really got to know him. I probably visited him for close to 6-7 months before he eventually passed. And during the course of my visits, I would tell him on the way out, I would say, Joe, you have a good rest of your week. And he always took pride in shouting back to me, you have a better one.
Uh-huh. Well, did he know that he was in hospice? Did he know he was going to die?
Yes, he did. He knew that he was in hospice care and was receiving hospice care. And of course, hospice care, technically, the way Medicare describes it, it's the last 6 months of life. Sometimes it's, of course, much shorter. Nobody really can say. But other times it's a lot longer, as I'm sure, familiar with Jimmy Carter's situation. He's been in hospice care over a year. So sometimes they last for a long time, even though they're technically in hospice care.
Well, what have been some moments with Veterans Last Patrol that made you proud of the organization, made you see that you were making a difference?
Not too long ago, I was visiting a veteran who had dementia. So his memory obviously was disturbed. And frequently when we were together, he would talk about construction and talk about building something, carpentry work. And it was difficult to understand him, but we knew he was talking about something related to construction and carpentry work. And so at some point after I got to know him for a few weeks, his daughter, who was his caregiver, gave me a copy of her dad's DD-214, which is a military document that lists some of your service record and history. And we were looking at that together, and the family, didn't know how to interpret some of the information in the document. But in looking at it, I was able to determined that after World War II, he was also a World War II veteran. He'd been a tail gunner in the Army Air Corps. But after the war, he'd been assigned to Fort Bliss in Texas and had been put onto duty for construction of the expansion of the base there, expansion of the camp. So where I'm going with this is by hearing him talk about construction and then looking at some of his military paperwork, we were able to tell and share with the family more history about their loved one's service than otherwise they didn't know. So they didn't know he'd been there and what he was doing there at Fort Bliss, but these conversations allowed us to tease that out of his memory so that we knew what he did after the war and where he went. And somehow, the way his mind was working at that time, he was associating me with the construction job he had in Fort Bliss after the war.
And his family didn't know that stuff, and you were able to pass it on to them.
That's correct. They didn't know that. A lot of families know surprisingly little about their loved one's service time and oftentimes don't have too much documentation. It's kind of sad, but when we get a veteran volunteer in the picture, through these conversations and dialogues, we're able to learn things about their loved one that they didn't know. And so, of course, we can share that and provide these stories and additional information to the family.
And the family members, is it somebody without family members, or are you there with family members?
Well, that's a very good question, Senator. It's unfortunately the case in America today that the dying process can be a very sad and lonely affair. Family sizes are smaller. There's a lot of fragmented families. Even intact families, the loved one may live on the other side of the country. So the veteran patient could be alone, not all of them. Of course, many have very supportive nearby families, but there's a surprising number of Americans in hospice care that are largely alone. So they're sitting where they are in a facility or at home with very little companionship. And, that's really the core of what we're trying to do is address this loneliness problem in the elderly. We have, for example, a Last Wish program, and we work with volunteers to realize the last wish of one of their veteran patients. Not long ago, we had, for example, a veteran who had a last wish to go fishing one more time, trout fishing in the mountains. And we were able to make that happen. So we got him up in the mountains of North Carolina, and he got down into a river in a wheelchair.
Really?
We worked with, we worked with a local fishing company, and we got him down in a wheelchair into the river, and he was able to catch one last trout, one last fish. And
Is that
really
right? What a beautiful moment that must have been.
It was. He was a Vietnam veteran, a Navy veteran, and had been a lifetime fisherman. And, he said, is there any way you guys can make it possible for me to go fishing? So we made that happen.
They had a veteran in hospice care wish to catch one more trout on a fly. I don't know how somebody says no to a request like that.
Does that feel good? You don't want to take his phone so we don't lose that in the real life? You're uncomfortable? No.
When we met, he was wheelchair bound, had relatively recent heart surgery. Think about how do you get an individual in a wheelchair down a riverbank into the water, situate him securely in the water, cast for him occasionally when he got a little tired, mend the line and let him control the drift, and he would set the hook. We picked a day when the fish didn't want to cooperate with us. Come on! Mr. Houck was starting to get a little bit physical discomfort after about half an hour. On the third cast, the indicator went down. He set the hook.
We caught a fish right then.
Possibly the longest trout fight I have ever experienced. Just wanting that fish to slide over the rim of the net and give him the chance to touch that last trout.
How has running this organization, being around these acts of kindness, affected the way you think about life and service? Has it changed you?
I certainly think it has. And I think it changed me in kind of a melancholy way. On the one hand, I'm saddened and disappointed in the absence of companionship for so many of our senior citizens, and that they just don't get the attention that they deserve. And that bothers me. And sometimes when I'm in these places, I look around and I I can see people want to talk to me, or they want to hold my hand, or when they do hold my hand, they might not want to let go. So things like that have made me sad. But on the other hand, I think we're doing what we can as a nonprofit to get more volunteers involved in this work. And the great thing about it is wherever you are in America, there's going to be a senior care facility not too far from you, sometimes several of them. So you can do this kind of support, this kind of volunteer work for Veteran Last Patrol, wherever you are in the nation.
Well, Colonel, I want to thank you for what you're doing, for how much you're giving back to our veterans, and thank you for being so candid about what's happening to them and sharing the stories that you've heard and experienced. I want to thank you for all you do for our veterans.
Well, thank you, Senator Brad. That's very kind of you, and I appreciate your speaking with me today.
To find out more, visit veteranslastpatrol.org. And you can also visit us on Facebook. Our Facebook page is American Voices with Senator Bill Bradley. Write me your thoughts and anything you've heard today. Thank you, Colonel.
Thank you, sir.
Is this the part where you find out I'm there for you? You find out I'm there for you. You find out I'm there for you.
Thank you for listening to American Voices here on my YouTube channel. For more interviews celebrating the goodness and creativity of the American people, click the subscribe button below.